Oh, good. Somebody plugged in the speakers. Okay, so I think last time I said that I'd have something up for you to watch before class. That didn't happen. And the main reason that didn't happen is because I was at this conference over the weekend. And besides the fact that I was busy in workshops at that conference, I was trying to get work done in the downtime there, which actually was pretty good because, you know, I was in the hotel, and so after the workshops ended, I had time to work there. However, the Wi-Fi at the hotel was a little spotty, and I was working on my AMP1 stuff before the AMP2 stuff just because I have them on Tuesday and you guys on Wednesday. And Saturday and Sunday morning, I was trying to upload stuff and it just wasn't letting me upload anything. So that held me up on getting the AMP1 stuff done. And I didn't quite get to your stuff. But I did want to point out something. I'm actually going to go to one of my AMP1 classes to show you what this looks like. I am going to set up the recordings a little bit differently than I have already. So you have the special senses and the autonomic stuff, and they were just a link right out to a presentation about that. What I'm going to start doing now is you'll see a folder that is the presentation stuff for that chapter. So like this is the cellular level of organization in AMP1, obviously. So clicking through to get to that chapter, that folder, you'll see a list of links to presentations. It's essentially the same as that one big presentation. I've just broken it up into smaller, more manageable bits. The idea is to have them be 10 minutes or so, well, hopefully under 10 minutes long each. So, all of them together would make up a big presentation, but making them a little bit more manageable in time might help you get to look at them a little bit better. If you wanted to go to a particular topic and watch that, you could do that straight away. You could do that in the sort of one big thing. You just have to move through that presentation to get to where you want to. And this way it'll be broken up. And I'm going to organize them on topic. So for instance, I was working on the endocrine stuff. I just didn't have it ready in time. But I was going to do an overview, what the endocrine system is, which actually would probably be like 3 or 4 minutes tops. And then a section on hormones, and then a section on the hypothalamus's role in controlling the endocrine system. And then I was trying to get together stuff to do a few different examples of endocrine function. So the ones definitely to cover are the pancreas and blood glucose regulation and growth hormone regulation. I was hoping to do the regulation of calcium homeostasis. I'm trying to use the pictures out of the book as much as possible. And unfortunately, in the book, there's a picture for 1/2 of calcium homeostasis, which is the parathyroid hormone's role. But then there's not a picture for the other half, which is the thyroid hormone's role. So I just didn't have a picture there and hadn't gotten around to trying to find a suitable alternate picture. One thing I'm trying to do with these presentations, in keeping with the book, is for the artwork to be not copyrighted. Instead of a copyright, the book is published under what's called a Creative Commons license, which means that anybody can use the material if they want to. They just have to give attribution where it comes from, but they don't have to pay royalties for using it. And so any artwork that I'm going to find, I'm going to try to use stuff that is in the same vein. Everything in Wikipedia is under that license. So I tend to use those quite a bit. It's just that, sometimes there's just not a good example of something. Like I was trying to work on the tissues presentation for A&P1 again. And I was trying to find a picture of a representation of mucous membrane, a representation of serous membrane, and a representation of cutaneous membrane. And I found one for mucous membrane, but it was actually the oral cavity mucous membrane, which is fine, except that it's a weird example, just that it's stratified squamous epithelium. But of course you know that because you're an A&P2, right? And then I was looking for serous membrane and cutaneous membrane, and I didn't look hard enough for cutaneous membrane because I just need to search for skin, and I'm sure I'll find what I want. But serous membrane, I couldn't find anything good. And the worst thing about apparently doing image searches in Google with the word membrane in them, is a lot of pictures of disgusting eyes, and I just can't really handle that. But anyways, yes, this week's material, there was not something for you to look at ahead of time. I am still going to try to get that stuff together, and I'll put it in there when I have it ready, which hopefully will be over the weekend. We'll see how that works out. And then I am also working towards next week's, which is blood. Actually, the blood presentation was sort of the first one I ever tried to get together like that. So I actually have some of it already. I just need to break it up into small parts, and I need to put the right artwork in there. So that'll be ready for you. So not having anything for you to watch ahead of time today, I'm going to sort of revert to the more lecture-based presentation of material, which is maybe not as exciting. While I'm in this folder here, however, I do want to point something else out. When you go into this folder the first time, this is what you'll see. There, of course, will be the part 1 assignment, and you won't see the parts 2, 3, or 4. Something new you'll see here is it says overview assignment. At a few different places in the course, there's 3 of them in the course, you'll have overview assignments. And what it is it's a part 4 type assignment, the same sort of thing, 3 6-point questions, open-ended, no timer, you can save your work and come back, exact same thing. But there'll be questions over a larger unit. And so this overview assignment, which is in the endocrine system folder, is for the nervous system and endocrine system together, comparing those things, which is actually, I think, at the beginning of the endocrine system chapter in the book, they have a little table addressing that, and they talk about a little bit there. But so there are some questions along those lines. And you'll see one also for the cardiovascular system. We have 3 chapters, blood, heart, and blood vessels. And so I have an overview assignment to address the 3 chapters together. And then you'll have one with what's considered environmental exchange, which is the respiratory, digestive, and urinary systems, which are all involved in bringing things in from the outside and getting rid of them. Getting rid of waste products. And so there'll be an overview assignment for those. With the overview assignments, you don't see the assignment here, just like you can't see parts 2, 3, and 4 here. To see part 2, you have to complete part 1 to an average of 80%. To see part 2, see part 3, you have to complete part 2 to an average of 80%. To see part 4, you have to complete part 3 to an average of 80%. To see the overview assignment, you need to complete part 4, but you don't have to get it to a particular score. And in fact, you can't, because you only have 1 attempt on that. But once you finish part 4, you'll be able to get into the overview assignment. And it'll be the part 4 assignment for whichever the last chapter is of that unit. So part 4 of endocrine for this overview assignment, part 4 of blood vessels for the cardiovascular overview, and part 4 of the urinary system for the environmental exchange overview. If you happen to be completing part 4 late, since going on to the overview isn't score dependent, if you submit part 4 late, you'll be able to get into the overview assignment. It doesn't have to wait for me to check it off because it's just the fact that you completed it will let you go on to it. It's not dependent on the score. So that'll be a little bit different compared to the part 1, 2, 3, 4 assignments. But so you'll go right into that. But in the space here between what says overview assignment and the endocrine system micrographs, you'll see a link appear there, which is the overview assignment. And it's just like a part 4 assignment, same basic structure, scoring, all of that. You just need to consider the nervous and endocrine systems together. And that will require, I guess is the best word to say, that you remember stuff from A&P 1, because that's when you started studying the nervous system. So in comparing the endocrine and nervous systems, there will be questions about the signaling molecules, and you should have learned about some of those signaling molecules in A&P 1. So there will be questions going back to that. And if you're not familiar with it, go back and look over those chapters in the book again. Okay. Okay, so like I said, I didn't have a presentation thing for you to look at ahead of time, so I'm going to kind of go back to the old-fashioned way that I present this. I had hoped if I'd gotten the presentations ready for you to watch that what I'd actually do is the lab material on these micrographs. This link here is some pictures that I want to show you about endocrine tissue. But also I wanted to do a endocrine system clinical case to look at for a little bit. But I'm not going to do that because we won't have time with me making sure that I cover the things that I think are important here. So I'm not going to use a Prezi presentation to do this because, in fact, my endocrine system Prezi presentation is in a state of flux right now, changing out pictures and that sort of thing. Or wait, is it? Maybe it's okay. Nah. I think I'm thinking of one of my other presentations that's not worthy to be shown. I do think there is one. Oh, that's right. That's what it is. So I've broken it up into the parts that I want to do, but I haven't actually, all 5 parts so far are the entire presentation. I just haven't erased the other stuff yet. And I haven't put any audio in. So I'm going to go ahead and use this a little bit to talk about things. And like I said, I'm going to put these things together and post them so you can use them, you have access to them. So I'm not going to go through everything that's in here, just the important stuff I want to highlight. I like to have a splash page in the beginning of these things, and what I'm tending to do is use the picture that's in the book as a splash page. So that's why there's a picture of a kid and a fall colored tree. And in the introduction part of this chapter, it explains why that's relevant to the endocrine system, which it's a bit of a stretch as far as I'm concerned, but it's talking about hormone signaling in plants, whatever. So there you go. Now, when we talk about the endocrine system, it's actually usually integrated with a number of other organ systems. But we tend to think about generally 10 specific glands that usually get lumped together as part of the endocrine system. That's not actually true. It's just the convention that we see in textbook presentations about this. So just starting at the top, from superior to inferior in this picture, not necessarily in any order of importance. There's the pineal gland, which is really part of the brain, but it releases a hormone into circulation. It's called the pineal gland because it looks like it's a pine cone. That's where the name comes from. There's only one of them. It sits right on midline, just posterior to the thalamus. So it's in the diencephalon. Not that this is terribly crucial, but I do actually set this up in A&P1. When we were learning about the diencephalon in A&P1, it said everything in that has thalamus in its name. So there's a thalamus and the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is actually what's referred to as the epithalamus in terms of the diencephalon naming, but we just call it the pineal gland. The hormone that it releases is melatonin, which you may have heard of. It's related to establishing the circadian rhythm, or the 24-hour cycle in your body. The pineal gland gets information through the hypothalamus that's getting a direct input from the retina. So when there's sunlight hitting the retina, the hypothalamus tells the pineal gland to stay quiet, basically. And then when sunlight levels go down and it's dark outside, then the hypothalamus stops telling the pineal gland to be quiet, and it starts releasing melatonin. So melatonin in your body, when melatonin levels go up in your blood, that's really a signal to your body that it's nighttime. Without that visual system input, the pineal gland would still release melatonin. It would just do it on its own kind of schedule, which it's probably stated somewhere explicitly, but I think it's like 25.5 or 26-hour schedule. So that would make your internal clock be a little bit longer than a normal day. And that visual hypothalamic input is there so that our internal circadian rhythm is synced to the diurnal rhythm of night and day. And really that's all it is. It's a chemical signal telling your body when it's day or night, okay, or telling your body when it's night, and the absence of that signal means that it's day. It helps to establish a number of processes that take place at night. I don't tend to talk about other types of organisms because this is a human anatomy and physiology lab, but the pineal gland actually, besides, I mean, I've kind of told you everything about it so far. So I like to add a little bit because I think it's interesting. In certain lizard species, their pineal gland is actually exposed directly to light and has its own photoreceptors. There's a hole in the top of the lizard's head. It's not an open gaping hole that things can get into. It's covered with a membrane, but it allows sunlight to go directly to the pineal gland so the lizard knows whether it's night or day, which helps with a lizard because they're cold-blooded creatures, and so they need to find sunlight to keep their body warm during the day. So it's directly tied into that. We don't have direct sunlight shining on the pineal gland, so it has to come through the visual system, and it's getting the unconscious or subconscious stream of input through the hypothalamus. The conscious perception of vision goes through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, and that's not doing anything to the pineal gland. There are some situations where somebody can be blind, lose their conscious visual perception, but still have visual reactions. The day-night thing isn't a big part of that, but the hypothalamus, which tells the pineal gland whether it's sunny or not out, will also tell the midbrain some things, and there are people who are blind who you can actually throw something at and they'll block it out of their way because they actually do see things, just not at a conscious level. And that's because the blindness is really a cerebral blindness. But anyways, so that's pineal. I just think some of the tying into the visual system is kind of interesting. It's for some reason not actually pointed out in this picture, but it is very important. The hypothalamus, which is located just superior to the pituitary gland and sort of next to the bracket that's outlined in the thalamus here. These two little pointy things in the picture just above the pineal gland are part of the outline of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also part of the endocrine system, and it plays a very important role for regulating the endocrine system. Really, the hypothalamus plays a very important role in regulating homeostasis in general. So it does that mainly through coordinating the endocrine and autonomic systems, somewhat with each other, but then just the hypothalamus is sort of the master control part of both of those systems. So it's not involved in every little thing. With the autonomic system, there's, you know, digestive system controls that are going on local within the digestive tract. And they don't need the central nervous system or the hypothalamus to play a role. Just like something like insulin controlling blood sugar levels is not concerned with the hypothalamus. But the hypothalamus has a way of controlling certain things. And so, again, moving kind of from superior to inferior, the next one in the picture would be the pituitary gland. This is, with the hypothalamus, part of the master control over everything. It sends out hormones that control a lot of the other endocrine glands. However, a lot of what tells the pituitary gland what to do comes from the hypothalamus. And we'll look at that relationship a little bit later on. But there's the pituitary. There's actually two parts of it. There's the anterior and posterior pituitaries. The anterior pituitary is a gland in its own right. It has cells that produce hormones and secrete them. The posterior pituitary is actually not a gland. It's just an extension of really the hypothalamus, and it releases some hormones that the hypothalamus makes into secretion. And again, we'll look at that a little bit later on. Then moving down, the next thing is the thyroid gland, which is located at the base of the larynx, or your voice box. It's essentially wrapped around the top of the trachea, or your windpipe. It doesn't actually go all the way around. This inset picture here is showing you a posterior view. And actually right here where it kind of comes down and it looks like, you know, butterfly wings coming to where the body is, it actually doesn't meet exactly in the middle there. The two sides will come kind of close, but it grows around from the anterior to surround. It never really quite meets in the back. But on the posterior side, these three circles here, which are actually not drawn to scale, did I say three? 4 circles here, which again are not drawn to scale, represent the parathyroid glands, which are just additional glands that are on the posterior side of the thyroid. The thyroid has a few different hormones associated with it. There are 2 which are just called thyroid hormones, and then a third one that's called calcitonin. What do you think calcitonin is related to? Calcium. Yeah, obviously in the name it has calcium. Calcitonin from the thyroid gland and the one and only hormone from the parathyroid glands together regulate calcium homeostasis. The so-called thyroid gland, so-called thyroid hormones are not involved in that. The thyroid hormones, which are, they have longer names, we usually just refer to them by initials, which is T3 and T4. They're responsible for coordinating metabolic activity in the body, okay? And they're not related to calcium homeostasis. Then in the picture, the next thing we see is the thymus, which is located inferior along the edge of the trachea, and what's not really represented in this picture, it's basically at the base of the heart. If we had a torso model here, like we have in the lab, you would not see the thymus there because it would be in the way of seeing the heart, especially the major vessels attached to the top, the aorta and those sorts of things. So usually we don't have the thymus in anatomical models because it gets in the way, but also those anatomical models are of adult humans, and the thymus really only is active in childhood and adolescence. So by the time somebody's an adult, the thymus isn't really an active gland. It's more important for immune system function and immune system development. And so once the immune system's developed, it doesn't really play a big role. And by the time somebody's an adult, that gland has pretty much all become adipose tissue. And then we have a big gap here. There's nothing much going on in this picture from the thymus down to the adrenal glands. Adrenal means on top of the kidney, and that's where they are. They're superior to the kidney. You may see some sources that refer to them as the suprarenal glands, which is just trying to change the name so that it sounds like superior, okay? And it's not an incorrect term. It's just that ad means exactly the same thing in this context. So adrenal goes with that. And then the next one is the pancreas. There's only one of them. It's located just posterior to and just slightly inferior to the stomach. It lays right next to it. It's actually only a little bit of an endocrine gland. Most of what the pancreas does is actually digestive in function, but it always gets included here, even though its endocrine function is a minor part of what it does, because what it does for the endocrine physiology is very well known and very well described, and probably every student's expecting to hear mention of the hormone insulin, and that's where what the pancreas does. And then moving down from that, we have the reproductive organs, and the endocrine glands from those are the ovaries or the testes. Obviously, nobody's going to have both of those unless they have a very unusual genetic condition. But those two are responsible for coordinating reproductive functions, and they use the so-called sex hormones like testosterone or the estrogen hormones or that sort of thing to do that. Now, those 10 structures that I just went through, the pineal, hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, parathyroids, thymus, adrenals, pancreas, ovaries, and testes, those 10 are the list that you usually see for the endocrine system. But it's actually a little bit misleading because there are a number of other structures that release hormones and play a role in endocrine function. And the pancreas is a good example of what I'm about to say, in that it's actually a digestive gland. It makes digestive enzymes. And its endocrine function is actually kind of small. It gets into that list because it's so well known for its endocrine function. But really, there are a number of organs that have endocrine functions that are minor compared to their main function, so they don't make it into this list. For instance, the heart releases a couple of hormones that play a role in keeping blood pressure low. The kidneys release hormones, or a hormone that's sort of the master control of keeping blood pressure up. The stomach releases hormones that regulate digestion. The intestines release other hormones that regulate other parts of digestion. So there's probably some endocrine function to pretty much any tissue. It's just we're going to concentrate on a few of them. And in fact, we're not going to concentrate on all 10 of these here. I've said everything that I'm going to about the pineal gland. We're going to look at the hypothalamus and pituitary in some more detail. We're going to look at the thyroid and parathyroids in some more detail. We won't talk about the thymus. That comes up when we look at the immune system, which is after we do the cardiovascular system. We'll talk about the adrenal glands. We'll talk about the pancreas. And then we won't talk about any of the reproductive organs until we get to the reproductive system. Okay. So, but these are the major players. When I was talking about the reproductive organs, I mentioned the ovaries and testes as the major reproductive glands. In this picture, they point out the uterus, which also has endocrine function. It releases hormones that play a role in regulating gestation during pregnancy. But again, we're going to save the reproductive stuff for the end of the semester when we get to that chapter. Up at the top, you can see hopefully the big words, regulation and growth and development, which is essentially what the endocrine system's for. And let me just zoom in on these and talk a little bit more about what it is. As far as regulation is concerned, again, the endocrine system is big in homeostasis, so it regulates a lot of things. I already mentioned circadian rhythms, which is what the pineal gland's melatonin is responsible for. Chemical concentration of interstitial fluids is just talking about things like calcium homeostasis that I mentioned. There's also sodium homeostasis, potassium homeostasis, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of things that are regulated for that, as well as directly regulating water levels in the body. Metabolism and energy, I mentioned the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. There are also some hormones from the adrenal glands that have an effect on that too. Contraction of cardiac and smooth muscles is a very general statement, but regulating blood pressure fits in with that. Regulating digestive function fits in with that. There are hormones, actually, presumably, I don't actually talk about them, that regulate respiratory function or something like that too. Hormones regulate glandular secretions, which sounds kind of self-referential, which is glands telling glands what to do. But in fact, that's true. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. The pituitary tells everything else what to do. And then they play a role in immune physiology. We won't be talking about this function really today. We're going to talk about it in the context of the immune system. But white blood cells communicate with each other through hormone signals a lot. Okay. Now, the other side of that was growth and development, which you could kind of think of as another aspect of regulation. But I've put this here to highlight a few things. So the growth of your body, meaning your bones getting longer so that you get taller, and various organs growing to fit into the increasing body size. That's regulated by hormones, and in fact, we're going to talk about that because it's growth hormone that regulates that. Hematopoiesis is the process of making blood cells, and there are hormones that control that. We won't talk about that today. It's actually a topic in the blood chapter, which will be for next week. And then I already said this, reproductive physiology, and we'll talk about that with the reproductive system. And then besides immune physiology that I just said, also immune development. The thymus is especially important for development of certain aspects of the immune system. But again, we'll save that information for the immune system chapter. This is one of those pictures that I need to replace because it's a copyrighted image. So we'll just pretend that it's not there. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, close your eyes for a little bit. Okay. This is just a summary figure talking about secretory pathways. And a lot of the hormones we're going to think of are protein-based, but then all the others kind of can get in on this also. But so let's pretend we're talking about a protein hormone like insulin. There's a gene for insulin that gets transcribed, and the mRNA leaves the nucleus and goes out to the rough ER, where there are ribosomes embedded into the membrane of the endoplasmic reticulum. And those ribosomes read the mRNA and make an amino acid chain. And that amino acid chain is now inside the ER, where it travels to its, I guess it's called its transphase or something like that, where it's packaged up into a vesicle, which then gets transported to the Golgi apparatus. The vesicle merges with the cis face of the Golgi apparatus and then moves from one layer to the next, and as that's happening, it gets modified and prepared for secretion. And then finally, when it gets to the transphase of the Golgi apparatus, it's packaged up in a vesicle that goes to the cell membrane and releases the contents into the extracellular space by exocytosis. Okay. For insulin, which we'll talk about insulin a little bit later, but I'm not going to talk about the secretory pathway for insulin too much. What's secreted in insulin is a little bit more than just insulin. Okay, I don't know what to do with my black. Oh, actually, let me do this. Okay. I don't know what to do with my black marker, so I'm just going to write this up on the board. The insulin protein or polypeptide is roughly shaped like this. It has a couple of disulfide bonds linking it together, making this big loop. And then it gets cut in the Golgi apparatus at two spots here so that this part of the loop is removed. This is called the C protein, I think, or something like that, which is, this is like the A protein, this is the B protein, that's the C protein. They're just named sequentially. So that's removed from the molecule, and this is the actual insulin molecule. It's much more complex in structure than I'm suggesting here, but at least its linear structure is represented. What's released here is all of that. So the C protein and the insulin molecule get secreted together. That's actually a useful tool if you're looking at somebody who's diabetic. You can establish the basic type of diabetes by looking at C protein levels, because if the cells that make insulin are making insulin properly and secreting it, and somebody's diabetic, you can tell that the insulin's being made properly because C protein levels will be at normal levels. But if C protein levels are off, then you know that the diabetes is caused by the cells not being able to make insulin properly or something like that. So, but it's an artifact of the way that insulin's processed through this, mainly in the Golgi apparatus there at the end, before secretion. Another picture that is actually copyrighted, and I cannot find a suitable alternative to this, so I think what I'm gonna have to do is draw one myself, because it's a fairly simple idea, but the book introduces the concepts here. They just don't have a picture to go with it. And this also is going to get a little bit at comparing the nervous and endocrine systems together. But in the nervous system, signaling molecules, which we call neurotransmitters, are released from vesicles, which are secreted just like the picture I showed you a second ago, except that they're secreted from a membrane that's very far from the Golgi apparatus. And so they're not processed quite the same way, and they're not proteins. But they're secreted through exocytosis, and they bind to the target cell on the other side of the synapse. Endocrine communication, hormones work by being secreted, and then they go into the bloodstream and find their target tissue far away from them elsewhere in the body. Okay, so synaptic communication is usually thought of as being very close. The synapse is measured in micrometers, maybe even nanometers. And then endocrine communication is long range because, for instance, in childbirth, oxytocin is released from the pituitary gland, which causes uterine contractions, which is, probably not a whole meter in distance, but still a good distance away comparatively. And so endocrine communication takes place through the bloodstream. We call the molecules that do these two things neurotransmitters or hormones. It might in fact be the exact same molecule doing that. Okay? But when it's at a synapse, we call it a neurotransmitter. When it's in the bloodstream, we call it a hormone. Now, that seemingly very simple black and white definition, gets hung up a little bit with this last thing I want to introduce, which is paracrine communication. Now, endocrine means to secrete within the body. Paracrine has that crin root in it also, which is talking about secretion. The para prefix to it is referring to the signaling molecules having an effect on local cells. They don't actually get into the bloodstream. So in the definition I just gave you, that hormones travel through the bloodstream, we wouldn't necessarily call the signals in paracrine communication hormones. But in fact, they really are. A cell might release hormones into the bloodstream, and those hormones might have an effect in the local tissue. It's the same molecule being released from the same cell. Its target is just either nearby or far away. It's the same. They're essentially hormones. And in fact, in the stomach, that happens. There are glands that release a hormone called gastrin, which will affect other cells in the gastric glands right there where it is. And it also gets in the bloodstream and have an effect on gastric glands on the other side of the stomach or something like that. So that will work in both the endocrine and the paracrine sort of way. It's the same hormone, just a matter of where it ends up going. Okay. The fact that I'm going to have to create my own version of this slide or whatever is kind of good actually, because it needs a fourth part. And that's autocrine communication. Okay. So if endocrine is talking about secreting hormones inside the body, i.e. through the bloodstream, and paracrine is talking about hormones that signal nearby cells, what do you think autocrine means?
Automatically.
Well, all of this is automatic in that sense.
The same cell.
Yeah, the same cell. It's a cell that releases a hormone that binds to a receptor on that same cell. It's an auto signal, a self signal, if you will. And again, the example I was giving you with the gastrin in the stomach works that way. So the cells that release gastrin are telling other cells in that gland that release digestive juices to be more active, but gastrin also tells the cell that's making gastrin to be more active and make more gastrin. And that gastrin can also get into the bloodstream and move to other parts of the stomach and have an effect. So in the book, it covers this. It talks about autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine communication. They're all just really different ways that hormones can communicate, whether it's a cell affecting itself, a cell affecting its neighbor, or a cell affecting something long distance. It's all kind of the same thing. And some cells can do all three. Okay? They don't really discriminate with where they're sending the hormones. It's just a matter of what cell has the receptor for that hormone. That's different from synaptic communication, where the signaling molecule, the neurotransmitter, is being released in the synapse, and that's a very specific location. The neurotransmitters can't really get away from that synapse and signal something else. So it's a very directed signaling between a neuron and its target, as opposed to an endocrine gland releasing hormones, and those hormones are going to have an effect in all sorts of different ways. Okay. So, now, I think it's very important to talk about the types of molecules that are hormones. And the way the book presents this part of it, which this is actually the picture of the book, so we're getting away from the copyright issues now. The way the book presents this is fine, it's all correct, but I think there should be a slightly different aspect to it, which the book then gets into soon enough about something else, which we'll see, but I want to kind of add it all together. Okay. So this table is just looking at the different types of molecules that are hormones. The first three are kind of all related. They're all essentially based on amino acids. Okay. Now, the first one is called an amine hormone, which means that it's an amino acid that's been modified by enzymes into a slightly different molecule and has an effect. Okay. Peptide hormones and protein hormones are chains of amino acids. Okay. And the distinction between peptide and protein is really just how long that chain of amino acids is. So the example they have here is 9 amino acids long. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the 9th and the 4th get a disulfide bond holding them together. So it makes this a loop, just its structure. It's just those amino acids in that order. I don't remember exactly for that hormone, which happens to be oxytocin, but I know for some peptide hormones, there's a gene that makes this huge, long polypeptide chain, and then that chain gets broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, and the pieces are the peptide hormones. As opposed to a protein hormone, which there's a gene for that protein's made, the whole thing is a hormone. Or most of it's a hormone and it gets processed afterwards, like insulin I was talking about earlier. So the example they have here is human growth hormone, which it's kind of silly. I hate when textbooks do this. It's growth hormone, okay? And we're studying human A&P, so obviously we're going to be talking about human growth hormone. And this is not any different from bovine growth hormone or porcine growth hormone or ovine growth hormone or shoot, I forgot the name for a lizard. Well, call it reptile growth hormone, okay? The species that it comes from isn't necessarily important. All growth hormone molecules are essentially the same thing. They might have slight differences because of the genome differences between organisms. But to call this human growth hormone is kind of silly. That's not important. It's called that because there's all sorts of stuff in the popular media about the effects of growth hormone in different ways, and people using human growth hormone for doping, or bovine growth hormone being used to increase dairy output, that kind of stuff. So it's put in there because most people don't hear the term growth hormone unless it's modified with where it comes from. But for physiology, that doesn't matter. That's not what we care about. Okay? So just growth hormone. So whether it's an amino acid itself that's being modified or chains of amino acids, short chains or long chains, they're all kind of related. And in fact, for the most part, those are all one class of hormone, what we call water-soluble hormones, okay? Which essentially means that they're polar molecules. They can dissolve in water. The last group down here, the book just has listed steroid hormones, and they show you the chemical structure of testosterone and progesterone. Okay. And you can see those two molecules are fairly similar to each other. They have the same kind of ring structure, and that's what makes something a steroid hormone. Steroid hormones are made from cholesterol. Cholesterol has that ring structure. And what's different between steroid hormones is just the things that are attached to the ring structure. So for testosterone, what's right here is different from what's attached to progesterone over here. It's not on the board here, but estrogen hormones, there are a few different hormones that are called estrogen. The main one is estradiol. But estradiol and testosterone are actually very, very similar in structure. In testosterone, there's a double bonded oxygen right there. In that same position for estradiol, there's a single bonded oxygen that's also bonded to a hydrogen. Okay, so very minor changes there. There's also one less carbon in estradiol than in testosterone. They're very similar because all steroid hormones are made from cholesterol, and cholesterol has that basic structure. Now, what type of macromolecule is cholesterol? No, it's a lipid, yeah. It's made out of, you might have been trying to think of hydrocarbon, which is what it is. We'll give you that one. Hydrocarbons are molecules that are made up of just carbon and hydrogen bonded together, which is a non-polar bond. And essentially that's what lipids are. Okay. Non-polar means that they don't dissolve in water. Okay. We refer to those as a class of hormones as lipid-soluble hormones. Okay. Now, what I'm going to get to talking about in a second is to discuss hormones in those two groups, water-soluble versus lipid-soluble. The book doesn't set it up that way to begin with, but then they get to talking about that with the pictures I'm going to show you in a while. But I do want to make a point of how this is misleading. Okay. There is a type of hormone that technically is an amine hormone, but it ends up being lipid-soluble because all of the polar parts of the amino acid is removed, and only the non-polar parts are left. And then there is a type of steroid hormone that is water soluble because it has a bunch of polar things added to it so that they can dissolve in water. Weird. The amine hormone I'm talking about, actually there's two of them, are the thyroid hormones, okay? T3 and T4. They're made from the amino acid tyrosine, which has, and this example here is also made from tyrosine. Tyrosine has this ring structure right here. Okay? Now, this is a water-soluble molecule because on the hydrocarbon ring right there, it has an OH there, an OH there, an OH there, and an NH2, I suppose that is there, all of which are polar and therefore would make this dissolve in water. But with T3 and T4, all of that stuff is removed and the ring is all that's left over. Okay? And in fact, one T3 or T4 molecule is made up of two tyrosine rings. They're put together. I can't remember now if there are any pictures that have anything suggesting the thyroid hormones in them, but if you see two six-sided rings linked together in reference to a hormone, that's a thyroid hormone that they're suggesting. Okay. As opposed to all the rings that you see down there in the steroid hormones. Okay. Now, I kind of already defined this, but just so that you see it. This is a very old presentation, and I wrote this stuff up, so this is perfectly useful information, so I'm going to leave it up there. But it basically just says that lipid-soluble hormones are those that do not dissolve in water, and water-soluble ones are the ones that do. And it has to do with whether they're made up of non-polar hydrocarbons or polar molecules like amino acids and proteins and stuff like that. If you haven't gotten this down, you can go to my Prezi page and find this presentation and see it later on. What's important about how soluble a particular molecule is how it moves through the bloodstream. Now we're talking about hormones, so everything's traveling through the bloodstream. Lipid-soluble hormones aren't going to like to dissolve in water, and blood, plasma namely, is essentially water. Okay? So lipid-soluble hormones have to have a special transport protein. The thyroid hormones have dedicated transport proteins that are made by the thyroid gland. Steroid hormones make use of proteins that are already in the blood, namely albumin, which we'll talk about next week as part of the blood. And then water-soluble hormones, since they're water-soluble, they're happy to dissolve in the plasma, so they just go ahead and do that. Now, besides transport and dissolving or being transported through the plasma, we also have to consider how these hormones interact with their receptors. Okay? So lipid-soluble hormones, because they're lipid-soluble, can cross through the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane. Water-soluble hormones, however, because they're water-soluble, can't cross the membrane, and so they have to deal with the receptors. I should have said lipid-soluble hormone receptors are inside the cell. Water-soluble hormone receptors are on the surface of the cell, and they they cause changes inside the cell separate from the hormone itself. Okay, so we have two pictures which are out of the book, and with the pictures I'm about to show you, this is where the book actually gets to talking about water soluble versus lipid soluble. And for whatever reason, they don't do that when they talk about the specific hormones themselves. So these two pictures are just looking at what happens. Oh, whoops. Okay, I got the titles wrong. I just realized. Where it says for water-soluble hormones, just pretend that says for lipid-soluble hormones, and I'll fix that when I get into this next time. This first picture is lipid-soluble, and the second picture is what would be for water-soluble hormones. Okay, just keep that in mind. Now, let me just zoom in and get rid of that title there. A little bit too close. Okay, so the picture here does kind of fail to make a point, which is fine because it's not what the picture is really for. But up here, this yellow egg-shaped thing is supposed to represent the lipid-soluble hormone. In fact, it should be connected to a transport protein so that it could be dissolved in the plasma. They left that out, which is fine because they're just trying to keep the picture as simple as possible. So lipid-soluble hormones will leave the bloodstream and get into tissues, and they can dissolve right into the cell by passing straight through the cell membrane. The receptor is a protein that binds to that hormone that's found inside the cell. Now, in this picture, it shows that binding taking place in the cytoplasm, which might very well be the case, and in some situations it definitely is. But also you'll see it happening in the nucleus itself. So where it's actually represented in this picture isn't terribly important. What is important is that it's inside the cell. Okay. But what's going to end up happening is the receptor hormone complex together will interact with the DNA. It becomes a DNA binding complex. And so it finds a spot on the DNA to bind to, which is because it recognizes a specific sequence of DNA nucleotides. And because it's bound there, it will increase the likelihood of the adjacent gene to be transcribed, which means that the receptor hormone complex increases the amount of a particular mRNA in the cell, which then gets translated more and more, and therefore increases the amount of that protein that's being made. Now, a very good example of this, which you've probably heard reference to before, is anabolic steroids. Okay? Where have you heard reference to anabolic steroids?
Sports.
Yeah, they usually get mentioned in sports. Why? Sorry? Yeah, they're used as performance-enhancing drugs, which are often illegal to use. The most straightforward example of that would just be testosterone doping. And if somebody's shooting up on testosterone, what they're doing is they're increasing the amount of that hormone in their system, which will then get into muscle cells, bind to the DNA in muscle cells, and increase the production of the muscle proteins, myosin, actin, those things that you learned about in AMP1. The more of those proteins that are available, then the more myofibrils that will be produced, and therefore the more contractive force a muscle can generate. Okay? It's completely stimulated by that hormone being present. Okay? Now, that's how it's used and abused in sports, but testosterone does that normally, and that's why it gets used that way. Testosterone obviously is the hormone found in men. Men have a greater muscle mass ratio in their body than women because testosterone increases muscle mass. It's part of the just natural sexual dimorphism in humans, and people that abuse it for sports are just trying to increase that muscle mass a little bit. Okay. So it works like that. But other hormones can work in similar ways. Doesn't have to be testosterone building muscle mass, but that's a good example of what happens here. Okay. Now, the other picture here is for water-soluble hormones, and if I had been the art director on this chapter, I would have made one change with this because it just seems a little strange, but it's not that horrible. So they have this very schematic looking cell here. The hormone receptor looks like a pimple or something like that sticking out of the cell. But in fact, what it is a membrane-bound, a transmembrane receptor complex. And I'm going to skip to another picture in a little while to show you some more of that. But that's what it is here. So now the triangle here is the hormone, which of course will dissolve in the plasma readily. So it's acceptable in this picture for it to just be floating around there. It moves out of the blood and into the tissue, and it will bind to that receptor. Okay. Now I'm going to show you another picture with a little bit more detail about this in a little bit, but let me use this picture to get it started. On the intracellular side of that protein, that receptor that the water-soluble hormone binds to, is what's called the G protein. Okay. And G proteins are enzymes that hydrolyze a molecule very similar to ATP. Okay. They hydrolyze GTP, which is why they're called G proteins. Now, the G in GTP is just standing for a different base besides what the A in ATP stands for. They're both nucleotides that have 3 phosphate groups attached to them. And when the G protein hydrolyzes GTP, it gets energy just like you could from ATP, which makes it physically move from where the hormone receptor protein is over to another protein, which is generally speaking called an effector protein. But in this exact example, they're talking about a protein called adenylyl cyclase, which is another enzyme. Now, what adenylyl cyclase does when it's activated by the G protein, it hydrolyzes ATP. It actually takes off 2 of the phosphates to make AMP. The M in there stands for monophosphate. And then the cyclase part of that name refers to the fact that it makes the molecule AMP circular. It binds 2 parts of it together, so it makes kind of a circular molecule. And that's what the C before AMP is referring to. Now, the fact that it's circular isn't terribly important. It's just a very specific form of this molecule. AMP, or cyclic AMP, at this point is referred to as the second messenger or secondary messenger, which is not, it's much more common to see it referred to as second messenger, but I think more grammatically correct to call it the secondary messenger. Doesn't matter. But that messenger then goes on to cause changes inside the cell. If it's the second messenger, what's the first messenger?
Is it the G protein?
A little further back than that.
The hormone?
The hormone itself, right. The hormone, being water soluble, can't get into the cell. So it binds to the receptor that causes all these changes, and the cyclic AMP in the cell is a signal that the hormone's bound to the receptor. So the first message is the receptor binding, is the hormone binding to the receptor. And then the second messenger is the cyclic AMP doing things inside the cell. Now, in this picture, they're kind of showing a few specific things it can do, but generally speaking, it can do a number of different things, like activating certain types of enzymes or other types of proteins. It can also cause an increase in gene transcription in the nucleus, which is not represented in this picture, but that's possible. So there's a number of different things it can do. This is a very specific example of a water-soluble protein's effects. Exactly what it's doing is not important, but it has metabolic changes in the cell. Okay, that's what it does. Now, I want to jump out of the presentation for a second. And try to find another picture to show you real quick. The problem with showing you this is that a lot of these pictures are showing more information than we really want. Shoot. Is that too small for people to see?
Yeah.
All right, let me see if I can find a different one. Oh. It's a good, simple picture. It doesn't get too bogged down with stuff, but it's too small. Oh, here's a really simple picture. Everybody can see that, right? Okay. So the water-soluble hormones bind to receptor types that are simply characterized like this. There are 3 proteins that are part of it. There's the receptor protein, which crosses the membrane. On the outer side of the membrane, that's where it binds to the molecule, to the hormone. On the inner side, it interacts with the G protein. Okay. When the hormone binds to the receptor, the G protein gets activated, and which means that it hydrolyzes GTP, and the energy it gets out of hydrolyzing GTP makes it move over to this other piece here, which is unfortunately not actually labeled. Oh, okay. Apparently, I just noticed in the little thumbnails here. Here's number 1. Here's number 2. So here's the G protein getting activated. And then here it moves over to this. Again, I said when I was showing the picture from the book, this adenylate or adenylyl cyclase is a specific name for this, but that hormone, that enzyme is referred to as a effector protein. Okay. Okay. Apparently, just those 3 pictures. So there's 1 and 2 again, and there's 3. It's essentially those 3 steps. Something binds to the receptor protein. It causes the G protein to be activated, which then activates the effector protein. This type of molecule, this type of receptor complex, is called a G protein coupled receptor, which is abbreviated GPCR, if you come across that abbreviation. Now, I need to add some stuff into the presentation, which will be essentially what I'm writing up here on the board. There are 3 parts to this: the receptor protein, and then the G protein, which is often hyphenated there, and then the one that I've been talking about that's called adenylyl cyclase. More generally, we refer to that as the effector protein. Now, there are a number of different types of G protein coupled receptors, and what makes them different is what is the exact effector protein. The most common example is this thing right here, okay, which the book uses as an example and is here. But there are a few other things that can be there. So I prefer that you think of it in the general term effector protein, because there are some situations where it's not that particular enzyme, it's some other enzyme, but they make the second messenger. Okay. So, just to point that out. Here's a even simpler example, but this has the name in it here. So you have the receptor protein, which binds to the hormone, the word agonist just means whatever binds to the receptor. But of course, we're talking about hormones, so we can call it a hormone. Then there's the G protein inside, which activates the effector protein. And then the effector protein makes the second messenger, which in the example we've been looking at is cyclic AMP, which then causes changes in the cell. Okay, so just a real simple, basic explanation of those parts. And I like this picture. I think I'm going to be putting this into the presentation. Okay. And I can because it's on Wikipedia, which means that it's not copyrighted. So you'll see that picture some more later if you go back to look at that. But that's what those, where'd it go? Receptor systems are like. Okay. So again, this is just what the book's version of the picture, but this thing looks to me like a pimple is the receptor protein. The thing looks like a bow tie on the pimple is the G protein. And then the purple thing over here is the adenylyl cyclase, which is the effector protein. Okay, so those three parts are the whole receptor complex together. Now, aside from the lipid-soluble hormones that use the receptor hormone complex thing that we just saw, all other hormone receptors are like this, okay? Neurotransmitters, however, come in two different, neurotransmitters are always water-soluble, effectively. And their receptors are always on the surface of the target cell. They, however, have two different types of receptors. One of them is this exact same thing, okay? So there are neurotransmitters that bind to G protein coupled receptors as well. But then from AMP1, the type of receptor that you were introduced to was the other type of neurotransmitter receptor. Can anybody describe what that receptor looked like that you learned about in AMP1? It was at the neuromuscular junction, would have been covered in the nervous system chapter 2, and it's a very basic structure. Any idea? Okay, let's see if we can walk you through this. What's the name of the neurotransmitter found at the neuromuscular junction? Yeah, acetylcholine. Okay. When it's released from the axon terminal at the neuromuscular junction and it diffuses across the synapse, what does it bind to?
Sodium.
Doesn't bind to sodium. Now, the simple answer to that is the receptor, which doesn't really further our attempt to describe this. But in fact, that's what it is. It's the receptor. But who can tell me what that receptor looks like? What does it do? You're getting a little ahead of yourself in the story there. The calcium comes later in the inside of this muscle. What happens, this is where the sodium comes in. Okay. The acetylcholine binds to the receptor, and that receptor is a channel that opens up and lets sodium into the cell. Okay. Sounding familiar now?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody recall what that's called? What the name of that receptor is? It's actually part of last week's material.
What's it?
Hmm?
What's the question? Can you repeat the question?
What's the name of the receptor found at the neuromuscular junction? And my hint was it's part of last week's material, which means it's also found in the autonomic system.
Acetylcholine.
That's the neurotransmitter. I want the name of the receptor. Right, the nicotinic receptor. Right. It's called that because nicotine will pretend to be acetylcholine and activate it too, which for muscles isn't important, but for the autonomic system is. Okay. It will activate, so the nicotinic receptors in the autonomic system are on all ganglia, sympathetic and parasympathetic ganglia. So it'll activate everything in the autonomic system, which if you're smoking, that means that you have sort of like a fight. I shouldn't say that. You have a competition between the fight or flight response and the rest and digest responses, sort of balanced out. Most systems, they cancel each other out. Okay, one is trying to make you pee, the other one's trying to make you keep the urine in your bladder, and nothing happens in the end there. If people wet their pants because they smoked, there'd be a lot less smoking in the world. But in the cardiovascular system, things are a little bit different. Okay, can anybody explain why that nicotine has effects in the cardiovascular system, autonomic side of things at all?
The sympathetic nervous system seems to have more effects on the heart and the cardiovascular system than the parasympathetic.
That's pretty good. I wouldn't say the heart so much as the blood vessels, because the heart does get dual input, but the heart's kind of weird in how it deals with that. So if you didn't catch that, you will be required to answer that question yourself later on anyways. So study up on it. I explained it in the presentation, and I'm sure it's at the part where everybody was already asleep, but it's in there. Because it's important to understand how a common drug of abuse like nicotine has an effect on such a vital part of the body like the autonomic system. But we're actually talking about the endocrine system today. I just sort of went off the side. So in the endocrine system, aside from lipid-soluble hormones, all receptors are like this. In the nervous system, some are like this, some are like the nicotinic receptor. Okay, but that's not the crux of what we're getting at here. So those are the types of hormones. Now, this is probably a good place to stop because we're obviously shifting gears. So let's go ahead and take a break. And then when we come back, I'm going to actually not continue on with the presentation, but I'm going to switch to the lab material, which I'll be showing you on the screen, but it's microscope images, which will actually kind of complement what we just covered. And then I have a few specific stories about the endocrine system to relay to you. So let's take a break and be back in here by that clock saying 3:15.